some cases, more than a handful, these expressions of hate have led to real world violence, um, mass violence. So this radicalization has real world implications on people's lives and their futures.
Welcome to Extremely, a podcast from the ADL Center on Extremism. I'm Oren Siegel.
And I'm Jessica Reeves.
So today our topic is games. What comes to mind for me is Monopoly, pickleball, basketball. Jessica, probably mind games. But we are not talking about those games today. We are talking about online games. And we have a very special guest, Mariana Olaizola Rosenblatt. She is policy advisor on technology and law at NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. Also, there's a lot more. Mariana is the author of a widely cited report, Gaming the System: How Extremists Exploit Gaming Sites and What Can Be Done to Counter Them. There's a lot more bio for Mariana, but we will put that in the show notes so that we don't spend half of this podcast going through all her very impressive credentials. Welcome to Extremely, Mariana.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, games make people happy. I'm not going to ask you what your favorite game to play is, but, our first question is an important one, which is, what led you to focus on how extremists want to exploit this platform that, brings joy and happiness to so many people?
It's a good question. It was the observation um, of incidents occurring one after another within a period of just several months, where mass shooters had been radicalized, um, or very entangled in gaming communities online.
Hmm.
That observation had been made by the press, by journalists, but loosely without much analysis. And it was the decision of my colleagues and I at the center that we needed to delve into it and see exactly what the connection was about, without falling back on very simplistic narratives about video games, but really looking into what was happening.
Yeah, so I know, for example, that media for many years had talked about how whether it's heavy metal music or rap music, makes the kids go crazy and violent. And the same has been in terms of like games like first person shooter games. But this is different, that you're explicitly looking at sort of whether extremists are having an influence, right, rather than sort of violence more broadly. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's going beyond. First of all, when speaking about online games today, we need to understand that these games are not just venues for entertainment, that is, content consumption. So it's no longer the case for very popular games, multiplayer games, that you go there and just interact with the content of the game, play a character, and that's it. Um, Nowadays people go to play these multiplayer online games because they want to interact with others, people around the world in real time, and the communications and networking features of those games are almost more important in terms of driving players, and creating network effects for the game titles. And so this social aspect, the communications aspect, is newish for people who still have in mind the arcades, of the 90s. And so
I won't
when
take
I'm
that
looking,
personally because that's exactly what I have in mind when people think about games, but that's okay.
yeah,
Mariana,
maybe I had a sense of that, yeah,
I
go
just want
ahead.
to clarify for folks. You're talking about like people sitting down and being connected obviously to the internet and then playing games with people around the world. There are conversations that are happening on the screen. People are, in the cases that you studied, people are maybe, trying to groom people or influence them or bring them into or over to certain mindsets or ideologies, right?
Yeah, exactly. So alongside the gameplay, so while you're moving your character around and trying to accomplish different feats, you can talk to people in real time, either via text, but more commonly via voice chat. So you can be sort of talking to them on the phone in a way with multiple people. And you can talk about the gameplay, your strategy, whatever that's what it's meant for. Or you can talk to them about politics, ideology, just throw out different edgy phrases, maybe test the waters, see who's sympathetic, and that's an opening for extremists. Online games are huge arenas, also arenas where a lot of young kids are. And so it's really a way for people of all ages to meet, make connections, and just around the world to share very troubling ideologies.
How much do you think the public perception of games has actually changed? Do you feel like people, and this may be outside the realm of your research, but I'm just curious, in that research, did you find that people were kind of coming in to gameplay with a more defensive attitude? Like, were they arming their kids with more tools to kind of stave off what might be happening on the extremist front, that sort of thing?
I think if the question is parents, there's huge variation. So some parents who play games might be very literate and exercise responsible oversight. Um, some parents have no idea what these games are, and they just know that their child is playing a game, and it's because it's a game, it's a digital playground. There's a connotation of, okay, it's innocuous because it's harmless because it's a game.
Right.
um it's not social media, or a site, pornography site or something that's clearly bad for children. But in case of games, many parents just kind of see it as pastime, a valid
Yeah.
pastime, and in many cases it is, but they're not aware of the risks.
I think it's important to step back maybe a little bit for the audience and maybe talk a little bit about, are there certain type of platforms that are more susceptible to this sort of extremist exploitation? And maybe is there like a story or an anecdote from the studies that you've observed and done that says like, what does somebody who encounters extremism on a game look like? Like for somebody who's never sort of seen it, what does it look like?
So there's a very simple recipe for a platform, any kind of online platform, but includes gaming platforms, that are susceptible to extremist exploitation. And the recipe is no moderation or lack of oversight by the platform leads to rampant exploitation. That has been the case with some online spaces, even some mainstream ones like Steam. In the case of like for the gaming ecosystem, a very important platform because it sells. It's the largest online storefront for PC games. Something like 1 billion accounts are on Steam.
Yeah.
And basically, anyone who wants to buy a PC game goes on Steam to download it, to buy it and download it, or in some cases, get it for free.
Yeah.
Um, and a parallel in the social media world is Telegram. Telegram has a very bare bones moderation, if any, and as a result, it has networks of all kinds of bad things you can imagine, terror groups, um, child exploitation groups, and so that's a simple recipe. And it is the case that many gaming platforms have lagged behind mainstream social media platforms in kind of recognizing the problem, instituting policies that are reasonable to deal with the problem, and then enforce them.
Yeah.
Steam is sort of like the prototypical example of that.
We're smiling. We're smiling, Mariana, because we just did a huge report on Steam
Yeah,
and sent it over to Valve, which is the parent company, essentially.
right.
And now there's some legislators involved, and people are trying to push them to really pay attention to this fact.
I think it's actually important to note, Jessica, not only did we go through 1.5 million, a billion, excuse me, profiles on Steam and find like nearly 2 million unique forms of kind of hateful and extremist content, but that the type of content was that people were, putting, you know, shooters, their photos
Mhm.
of, the Christchurch shooter, the Poway shooter, the Pittsburgh shooter, etc., on their avatar, or they would use certain hate symbols or language that was kind of if you're in that space, you would recognize it. And then some also very kind of easy to detect type of hate and extremism. And so our concern was that this was an introduction to kind of the worst of the worst through a platform in which you're supposed to be, you know, finding community, to your point earlier. I mean, are you seeing, Miranda, that same sort of, in terms of tactics, whether it's audio or text during games, like how are those being manipulated to introduce people to extremist concepts?
Yeah, first to reflect on your work on Steam, which I think is super important. Um, Think about Steam and the extremism that I've seen there, is that the language is just so brazen, so explicit and shameless.
Yeah.
And it's also a lot of it, most of it is public. So it's actually quite easy for Steam to detect it and moderate it. Um, that is, if it's clearly extremist and violent and against the platform's stated policies, they should be able to get rid of those accounts, or punish them in some way. But in the case of games, and what I was talking about before, which is a lot of real time communication, ephemeral
Hmm.
um, interaction, it's actually more challenging to detect, again, in real time,
Yeah.
um, extremist recruitment. There's an assumption of privacy, which I think can be challenged, but an assumption that certain gaming chat rooms are meant to be private because they involve a smaller number of players. It's not a public, arena. In some cases, it is in some games, but not a lot of them. And so there, it's actually, you could say that games have that face challenges or have issues moderating, um, have sort of a more legitimate point that it's hard. There are some kind of barriers to doing that. But for Steam, it's just so egregious because it's rather easy to find, as you probably found in your quantitative analysis, these very shameless expressions of um, violent glorification of mass shooters, some
Yeah.
really just like
Yeah,
black and
if
white
you
bad
can't
things.
deal with the blatant brazen, to your word, like stuff that anybody could find, then what is the reasonable expectation that users have that they will deal with the harder to find issues, the ones that, maybe a little bit more invisible or harder to track because they're, cloaking themselves by design. I think that is a reasonable thing for parents and users of all kinds and people who are concerned about these issues to ask these platforms. So yeah, you're raising a fair thing, and I guess the point is that somebody has to, um, like elevate this. What do you think is like an effective way to convince people to care about this, and maybe not the industry? Let's start with like everyday people. Why should people care that their kids or I don't know, parents, I guess, to some, anybody in their family, I mean mostly kids though, why should people care that there may be some expressions of hate on platforms?
Yeah, the straightforward answer is that in some cases, more than a handful, these expressions of hate have led to real world violence, mass violence. So this radicalization has real world implications on people's lives and their futures. So that's it's not like it happens online and stays online and it's just trash talking or fantasizing. No, these things, the the gaming the gaming backdrop makes it seem like it blurs the boundary between fiction and real, right? Because it's a game, there's often this kind of like assumption that it's fictional, but what people are talking about is real ideologies. And they might hide behind this kind of notion that it's just a joke or they're playing around with concepts and they're not really serious. And they do that a lot, extremists, to, again, blur the line or make it ambiguous. But in the end, they're um, attempts to sort of signal their extremism and normalize it. So that's a huge part. It's like not just it's happening, but it's become more or less accepted in some gaming communities, normalized. And then once it is normalized, you can identify, the more susceptible children usually, to then take off platform to adjacent spaces, and indoctrinate them further and prime them basically for, again, real world, um, extremist action.
You know, it's
Yep.
it's not only the violence, it's the behavioral stuff, it's the, treating people poorly or bullying or all of these other things that, we know have a real impact on psychology and on well-being and mental health and all those things.
That's a good point because a lot of the harm that occurs online is still actual harm. ADL has conducted surveys where they ask players who've been harassed, which is a huge portion of the player base, um, how that has impacted them. And, as significant portions of the surveyed players expressed they had suffered, post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health harms, or, had impacted their lives, yeah, their time in school, their daily life in a host of other ways.
You've written about the connection between the need to address this hate that we're talking about and extremism in gaming and sort of human rights more broadly. I don't know if that's a connection that a lot of people would necessarily make. Um, can you speak about specifically, like, beyond the importance of combating extremism and hate and protecting our communities and all that, but just kind of like sort of broader as like a human right that we should be free from the type of people that are preying upon young people in these spaces, perhaps?
Yeah, so there are two levels of connection I draw between extremism in games or anywhere, and human rights. One is, on the philosophical level. Human rights are premised on the assumption that everyone has equal worth and dignity, um, no matter your race, ethnicity, gender, other physical attribute. Um, but a lot of the extremism in games specifically is hate based. It's based on identity factors. So against particular communities, LGBTQ, um, Jews, certain races, any minority really is subject to a lot more harassment. On the other level, and connecting it back to real world, consequences, these actions in game, do have impacts on specific human rights that are enshrined, that are contained in international human rights documents that guarantee these rights. Um, One is the right to life. It's, the simplest one. When, there's again a very serious, incident of violence, real world violence that implicates people's, right to life. Another one is the right to non-discrimination. That's implicated anytime someone suffers identity-based harassment in game, which again occurs very frequently.
Yeah.
Um, right to health, and that includes mental health. So, um, these are, in the US at least, the concept of human rights doesn't have huge traction. People think more in terms of constitutional liberties, and human rights is not like a household topic of conversation. But, people should know that human rights are guaranteed under certain legal instruments, international legal instruments. Um,
I need to stop and
yeah,
say
yeah.
you're absolutely right in that sentence, and it just made me a little sad to hear. Like, in the United States, people, human rights isn't as as big of a deal, and again, it gets me back to like when how do we make people how do we make people care about these issues, right? I mean, clearly you've made a case for why it's part of should be part of our understanding of human rights.
Yeah. Well, there's different kind of ways to interpret your question. One is, how do we make people regularly, children who play games, parents, people in society, just anyone care about this? And one is to show them tangibly, what this looks like in the real world, like what examples, what the press does, whenever there's something, harmful that has happened, some child groomer who kidnaps a little girl on Roblox, the game platform, and then, that sort of like in itself leads people to care, I think, on a visceral level. But if you mean how do we get companies to care and do something about it through pointing out what we've been doing, raising awareness, and calling for more or better company self-regulation, that I'll say has worked with some companies and worked only to a limited extent. So I think we need to continue raising awareness and continue pushing companies, is work that my center does, engaging with companies directly, telling them, hey, we have this evidence, we're going to publish it. What are you going to do about it? Here are some things you can do. They're realistic, pragmatic, actionable, and we can continue doing this. But that has only worked, again, for a few companies, the more sort of open-minded and responsible companies. For the others, there's the blunt tool of regulation. And for any game industry people who may be listening, I if you don't know this already, regulation's already here. It's not a matter of debating whether we should have regulation for the gaming industry. There's already regulation on online safety globally that applies to the gaming industry and demands certain very concrete things. There's something that has happened only in the last few years, like in the last 5 years. Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Singapore, the EU, to name a few, have enacted online safety regulation, and a lot of it, if not all, arguably applies to at least some gaming platforms, and Steam would be one of them. And if I were the CEO of Steam, or Valve, the owner of Steam, I would be quite trying to get my act together right now, because I can name several provisions that do apply. Policymakers are sort of done waiting, actually, for self-regulation, and this is something that has changed only recently. But now there is actual law that can be enforced. The question after that is, okay, how is it going to be enforced? And the work now for advocates like me is, or researchers, is to raise awareness among policymakers and regulators who have written these laws but don't know that they actually apply to these games, don't have games on their radar in the most for the most part.
I hear what you're saying about people may be ready for regulation now because self-regulation hasn't worked. At the
Mhm.
same time, I know that there's also almost this narrative of like censorship is is not something that we are going to accept in this country anymore, right? I don't know that I'm sensing that there's an appetite for people to actually regulate
Yeah.
social media, but actually the other way around,
Mhm.
which concerns me, right? Which means that we have to think about other ways to address these things. But it's probably country based, to your point. I guess I'm thinking about the U.S. I'm wondering
Yeah,
if that's true
it's a,
here.
it's a fair question. So um, I named a few countries abroad, or regions in the case of the EU, but there's also very active space in the US states. So I can name a few states: New York, Maryland, California, have passed online, especially laws that try to um, protect children online. So they're aimed at protecting children, but in effect would protect a lot of other users. And so you're right. At the federal level, it's unlikely that there will be a law addressing, first of all, extremism. Is not something that under the First Amendment the U.S. can regulate, and a lot of the state laws I mentioned before, to the extent that they regulate content, like the extremist content, they would be unconstitutional. So that's true in the US, not in other countries. And many of these gaming platforms operate internationally. So even if they're not caught by laws in the US, they'd have to abide by other countries' laws, which do regulate content. They don't have a First Amendment. But then in the US, you could say, okay, we can't regulate content directly to the extent that it's not illegal. If it is illegal and sexually exploitative content, or sexual explicit material that implicates minors, is illegal. And so if it is illegal, you can regulate it. If it's not illegal, like a lot of extremist content isn't, then you can still regulate platforms obliquely by requiring transparency, by requiring better designs and procedures. So if they have a reporting system, for example, for users to report extremist content that's, according to the platform's terms of service, not allowed, then they have to manage those reporting systems in a timely way. So there are certain things without regulating content directly, you can regulate these platforms as businesses and demand that they operate kind of responsible, well functioning businesses.
One thing we haven't really touched on, and there's a real undercurrent in gaming of pretty hardcore misogyny, and just sexism, and expressions of hatred for women, and expressions of violence against women, and all of these things. Do you see any sort of changes or movement on that front, in terms of, or is it all just part of the same kind of like big soup of horrible things that is just
Mm,
not really getting the attention it needs and getting any better in any meaningful way?
Misogyny and violent extremism, they kind of go hand in hand. So they're part of the same soup, as you said. In many cases, like incel communities are also, white supremacists. Like these ideologies intersect in weird ways often.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of the general toxic environment against women in gaming, some game studios have, traditionally games were um, very tolerant of misogynist um, and sort of not intentionally so perhaps, but the games themselves were very sexist in how they portrayed women. This, the whole Gamergate scandal in
Yeah.
2014 was about this. But some game studios have started, adding more diversity to their characters and all that. That's great. The community aspect, the cultures inside the games, I don't know if they have changed much. I mean, in our survey that we did, our center, we found that some, alarming, I think, percentage of players um, encountered statements sort of justifying violence against women, and this included players under 18, so children and teens, um, and even higher percentage saying that women are inferior.
Over the years, people say you could tell a lot about a society, and they usually say, "Oh, but look at the people in prison," or look at the there's so many ways to kind of gauge the health of a society. Um, and like the way societies play games is like I would argue a big part of that. You probably tell a lot about it, and since most people, I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of people around the world, right? I mean, this is not fringe. I'm not sure people of a certain age like realize that younger children are sometimes getting spending as much time in the gaming space than they are watching television or on social media, and probably more, as somebody with children, I know this very well actually. But the point is, I actually think that one of the most underreported issues in our country, in the world, is the amount of extremism in spaces where our children are. How can listeners stay informed and support efforts to combat extremism in gaming?
There are many things they can do. So a player who encounters extremism can report it. Steam is kind of new to this, but most gaming platforms have reporting functions. Another thing is to, if you want better policies around this, write to your, representatives. Senator Warner, who wrote a letter to Valve after right after the ADL's publication.
Our Steam report, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Prompted the company to sort of reply for the first time. I have never had any luck contacting Valve or Steam in my research. We always try to engage with companies that we mention by name, and they've been totally unresponsive. You might be surprised to know that there are some platforms, who don't care, don't reply, just get away with it. And that's why I think regulation needs to kick in, because for those really awful players who just simply don't care, not even, that the public, they're making money and they just don't care. Um, for them, the only thing that will work is fines and maybe prison sentences. But I mean, not in the US. I mean, I'm not saying that, but actually, it's happened that the CEO of the founder of Telegram, as you probably know, was arrested in France because he was kind of chronically non-responsive to French law enforcement requests for information about child predators and people who were conducting all kinds of criminal activity on Telegram. And Telegram just ignored every law enforcement request for information or notification of something illegal that was happening.
Right. So I think our listeners are, what I'm hearing you say is, so for our listeners, make sure that we help get these CEOs arrested, right? That's what you're saying. Oh, no, no, my bad. No, I'm misreading that.
This is just a reflection on when you have companies that are irresponsible and just don't respond to any public outcry, or then you need to, then other measures need to kick in. I don't advocate for arrests of CEOs. I think it's problematic, and you would have to be implicated in directly implicated in illegal activity. I don't know if Telegram's founder was. That's something unfolding in France, but what I'm saying is listeners and just regular people, players, can try to persuade companies to raise awareness, use the reporting functions, just sort of contact their representatives, raise their voices, all that.
Yeah.
And it might work for some companies,
Yeah.
probably will work for
I
some
wonder if there's
companies.
also a way to like, sometimes as a parent, I'm not a parent of children. I'm actually a parent of content creators and gamers, right? Like
Mhm.
that's what they. And so like it would be great as I'm raising my little gamers or whatever, if I knew how they can use their powers as people inside the community who are part of that, as they grow older, etc., to
Yeah.
have the tools to report, like you said, which is always going to be very important, especially for those that want to be responsive to it. But I wonder if there's ways to like creatively use the gaming space to fight for good.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up because there are positive ways to, there, just like extremists can exploit games, people with good and human rights aligned values can also use games to promote positive narratives. And Luc Bernard, I don't know if you're aware of his work, but he's a game developer who created a Holocaust museum on Fortnite.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, just initiatives like that. Right now, some games are games where you play pre-established content. Some games on Roblox and Fortnite and Minecraft allow the players to create their own worlds. So go ahead and create just worlds, worlds where people are treated well, and people can gather good information. Just use your creativity that way, basically.
My concern is always like, um, when people are in these spaces and they see this stuff over and over and over again, do they just become sort of the frogs in the water that's getting hotter and hotter, and they don't even notice? Like, it just becomes the water that they're in. And like, what is I just I worry about that so much with like kids who are still figuring things out, who don't have fully developed brains, who are kind of processing all of this in real time. Ah, I don't know. That's my very, very worrisome sort of note on all of this, that, we're creating spaces where it's not extremism, it's just what's normal.
So Mariana, make us feel better about that.
No, I'm afraid I won't. It's a dim note to end on, but it is true. Psychologists like my colleague Rachel Coward. I encourage you to look at her work. Has looked into this phenomenon of, well, one, normalization of toxic and extremist ideologies in gaming spaces, and also identity fusion. So when players see that happening, they'll sort of appropriate those ideologies fairly easily because they want to be included in the gaming community. And so it is a real risk, and I think parents just need to, and educators need to be watchful. And if first, try to exercise some oversight over the on the spaces that your kids are at. Make sure they are aware that some things they might encounter are just wrong. And um, I think education is the only answer there. Parents may want to, if they see that their kids are reacting in weird ways after playing a certain game on Roblox or something, try to figure, get to the bottom of what is that game, what are people talking about there, and it's very possible that they are encountering these kinds of
Sure.
um, you know dark narratives. So I think oversight and education, um, yeah, is probably the best
We
answer.
we really appreciate you spending a little time talking about games, not in the way that people usually talk about games, probably, but I think an important conversation, and your insights and your research into kind of what not only the problem is, but what options people have, who we need to hold accountable, and what we can do ourselves in our communities to try to push back against something that seems to be growing, probably will only get worse, but doesn't have to end, terribly, right? And I can't think of something better and more noble, I guess, to fight for than our games. So
Mm,
I do view this as our little effort to be part of that battle. Thank you for what you do. Thanks for joining Jessica and I on this podcast.
thank you so much for the great conversation.
Thank you, Mariana.
One more thing. For those of you who may still be listening, please subscribe to the Extremely newsletter, where every week you are going to get not only the most important information in extremism, but you're going to really want to come back for more.